This is Face the Nation. We're discussing the mega development projects taking place in present-day Sri Lanka and its correlation with corruption. We have three eminent personalities in our studios today as well. My first question is directed to Professor Rohan Samarjiva. Professor, there are grand plans for Vision 2025 in terms of infrastructure. Now, my question to you is this attainable? Is it realistic? Or is it hasty? Does Sri Lanka have the kind of money to fulfill these?
Now, if you take sort of the one-liner, the gist of the 2025 vision, it's that we will be a hub for the Indian Ocean region. There's a very nice infographic with Sri Lanka and the distances in nice concentric circles, and you can see the markets that would be covered by that. So the issue then is, I mean, we have got two ports. We have got one airport that is even currently, though over capacity, in Katnayaka, which is serving as some kind of regional hub, has been for some time. So we have some possibilities. We have a vibrant private sector logistics industry. So vibrant that in fact our logistics people have gone and set up shop in Bangladesh and India, and they are doing business there. That is something I was quite surprised by. So we have some of the ingredients for this vision. I agree. The issue is, now for example, let's take the infrastructure issues. Without concrete, solid energy, reliable energy supply, can we do this? Without the transport connectivity. For example, if you're going to develop Trincomalee or Hambantota, they need to be articulated to the current hub, which is Colombo, right? We need to develop the dry ports. So for these things, we do need the infrastructure. That's where I'm quite frustrated by this conversation, which is, you know, let's take 21 years to do infrastructure. We can't take 21 years to do infrastructure. We have to do it in a compressed time frame. Because if we don't do that, you cannot have this vision realized. So that, I think, is something we really need to think about. We need, for example, I mean, that's why I am skeptical about this Ruanpura business. If I were looking at if I'm deriving my priorities from the vision, which I think is okay, and this is a vision that was there even in the previous time. I can remember in 2010, Dr. Gunarwan and I were debating these things on a TV program about the 5 hubs. So this idea is not only limited to one party, it's across the political parties. But then we must be able to get to Trincomalee. Today, all we have is we have got a road going over the Kantale Bund, and everybody is complaining that this thing will fall down. And we have a decrepit railway line that is incapable of doing proper speeds. So we really need to pay attention to the infrastructure issues. And what I see is, even though it's not in the vision, maybe the government is trying to fast track it. But since I mean, again, I'm now confused. Why are we trying to build a road to Ratnapura? When in fact, if for the vision proposal, we should be prioritizing Hambantota, Mattala and Trincomalee. Why? What is this thing about Ruanpura? Is that political considerations? Now, this is where the technical discussion, the public debate should come in and say, let's prioritize. We can't do everything. We don't have the resources. Let's do a few things that are high priority, and let's do them well to realize the vision. I have nothing against the vision. I just wish visions are realized in this country sometime.
Continuing from the final few statements that Professor made, Mr. Chandrasiri, what do you think is really the thinking behind Ruanpura? I mean, are you aware of this, or is this supposed to be new?
Not really, it was new. It was not in our planning horizon, but then it was started. So I am not really in the know as to why it started and all that. But then anyone can say that from Colombo to Ratnapura, okay, it's the road is congested, takes so many hours. But then most of the roads are like that, if you look like, but then there has to be a plan, as we were talking about National Planning Department, fiscal planning and all that, and the Vision 20.
Mr. Chandrasiri, don't all these stakeholders get together and have a couple of meetings?
Yeah, that is one of the shortcomings, I think. They do not get together and come. But then there was a procedure where we had to send everything to the National Planning, and National Planning had to review and appraise it and then come back. And as Dr. Gunran was saying, there was a system. But then you go on frequently short-circuiting, then the system sort of becomes defunct. So
and we have this situation now. For example, if you go back to the old National Physical Plan, yes, Kandy was not supposed to be a city that was to be expanded and developed. It was Dambulla, Anuradhapura, Trincomalee triangle. Now suddenly Kandy has become a priority area. Again, I mean, I'm at a loss to understand why we have a National Physical Plan which says Kandy is to be maintained at that level, and then maybe the fact that the minister is from Kandy has something to do with it. I don't know. These are mysterious prioritizations that I don't understand.
Rohan, I think rather than we debate whether it has to be Trinco, Kandy or Hambantota.
No, I'm not debating. I'm saying it is in the plan.
We need to have, I mean, okay, I take it. That is why I say that there should be a professional way of deciding priorities. I agree with you. Whether it is Kandy or Hambantota or Trinco, I don't mind. But it has to come from a thorough physical national economic plan. It should not come from someone's mind that today it is Hambantota, tomorrow it's Polonnaruwa, next day it is Trinco, next day it is Kandy. Now the whole problem is we have killed that process of systematic planning. The moment you have killed this systematic planning, then every time a government changes, we change the priorities and plans, then you take 21 years to develop a road. If you kept into one direction and one proper plan, you would not take 21 years to develop a highway. Now, don't blame the current procedure that it takes longer time when the political authorities jump in and meddle around with it and then change the states. When they change the goalpost, and then later you say it's late and we are now in a rush and we need to hurry up and all, and then short circuit the whole thing and go into wrong decisions.
Mr. Guruduan, you are impinging on the time of Mr. Chandrasiri. So, Mr. Chandrasiri, you were a former additional Director General of the Road Development Authority. During your time in that office, and now, what are the differences you see in terms of procedure implementation?
Not much, I think, because I retired about 1.5 months back, so I don't think there is any change. I was there, but
however,
then I was referring to say pre-2000 or pre-2005.
When you were still in office?
Yeah, I was in office and yes, I was in different capacities. But then this 21 years, which took 21 years for us from the planning table to the opening of the Southern Expressway, it had a big story about it. That, as I said, started with the highway, then the expressway, made the expressway in 1996. The decision was taken by that government. 91 was another government, and in 2001 contract was given by another government, and in 2005, 2006 it was made 4 lanes by another government. So all the governments came and started changing the scope of the work. That's why finally it was opened in 2011. So generally, if there is, I would say in Sri Lanka, maximum within say about 10 years, we should be able to complete the expressway of that scope. From the planning to the finishing, if we don't have any problem with the funding and all that, so that we have to may hold up. But implementation wise, 4 to 5 years should be okay for this 100 sort of kilometers of expressway. And if you want to short circuit, you shorten the period, you can, but at a cost. It will be a higher cost than if you make it saying that okay, I want it done in 3 years. The cost probably will be more compared to a 5-year implementation period. So, as far as the Sri Lanka engineering community is concerned, I think they can't be blamed for this taking of these 21 years, and it's not the norm also. We should not go with that.
What about Karnataka? Karnataka also took a long time?
Karnataka, because Karnataka, they didn't have money. 84
all
we
kinds
had.
of crises?
Yeah, yeah. Because 84 we started, I think, talking about Karnataka Expressway. In the first no, then the first contract was given in 1995 or something like that, and with our money.
Then we went to arbitration.
No, then we had to stop it because we ran out of our finances, and then we went not arbitration, not settlement.
Mr. Gunarwan, during your time as Secretary to the Ministry of Transport, what was the infrastructure planning like? Now, when we, I'd like to juxtapose that with this question. Now, when we're talking about the Central Expressway especially, there are several allegations. So present day we're dealing with large numbers of allegations when it comes to these mega development projects. During your time as Transport Secretary, was there infrastructure planning, proper streamlined procedures? What's the difference that you see?
First one is that Transport Ministry did not have highways under its purview. So that's totally out.
Right.
But during our ministry, in 2015, we prepared a master plan, and that master plan very clearly laid down the objectives and medium long-term objectives, and then even flagship projects were identified.
Right.
And then the policies and procedures were laid down as to how we should go. Now, for example, the prioritization of the public transportation, prioritization of the railway by way of public investment was very clearly laid down.
Right.
And rather than going into very fancy mega projects, you try to go with the projects where you can have the highest benefits with the limited amount of resources that you can have quickly were put forward. For example, bus rapid transit, BRT, was a flagship project in our proposal.
Right.
And today that has been taken out, and I was told that they are talking about LRT system, which is very high expensive system. As Professor Samarajiva says, when the requirement is fast access of Trincomalee or Hambantota, you are talking about some $60 billion project to have something do a light rail system. When in our ministry in 2015 we prepared a plan to have an ordinary railway connection between Battaramulla and Colombo. Now, these kind of plans, when you have prepared those plans and submitted to the government of Sri Lanka, if the political authorities don't implement those, I think it's very unfair to blame the ministries or the officials or the railway department or the institutions under that. Now, if anyone asks what happened to that master plan, I can't answer, because what happened thereafter is beyond our reach.
So you're saying that politicization gets in the way of work being done? Is that what you're saying?
Obviously, yes. That's what I said. That's the plague of this country. That's the malady of this country. And professional leverage, the margin the professionals have to develop their plans is not there in this country. The political authority jumps in and changes it with whatever the color it is. I mean, then you lose the whole sense, and then at the end you have no answer. Now BRT is postponed. Now you are talking about a fancy project, and for the next 2 years you have nothing. And then when the speeds do drop down to, average speeds do drop down to 9 or 10 kilometers per hour, then you are in a chock-a-block situation. Then you say, oh, we have no time to waste, it is in a rush now, we have to hurry up, and then you go into a fancy project with a very expensive kind of thing, and that wastes public money. So basically our urgency is created, it's not natural. We, by our action of postponement and political meddling, we create the urgency by ourselves, and then we shout and blame, and again public is to suffer by implementation of wrong projects. So this is a crime in this country. I think the first thing to do, as this Maitri Palana promised, you need to re-establish the planning procedure, the National Planning Council, and re-establish the capital budgeting procedure with the professional input on that. Politicians should not have any say on it.
Right, thank you very much. I invite, open the floor for questions from our journalists. Nadim, let's start off with you.
Thanks, Sonali. Professor Samarajiva, you just listened to the views expressed by Dr. Gunarwan. regarding the National Planning Council. Do you think that we need to re-establish those mechanisms, strengthen those mechanisms, and have proper infrastructure planning system in the country? Are we seriously lacking in that department?
Well, infrastructure, definitely. I think I began by saying that we need to release infrastructure from this 5-year or whatever, even less oscillations. Whenever the politicians come, whenever a new political party comes in, they think they can reset infrastructure policy. But infrastructure just isn't like that. It's long gestation periods. It requires planning. It requires the kind of things that we've been talking about. I mean, we have been agreeing on that aspect.
And there needs to be multi-sectoral coordination of infrastructure projects as well. Do you see that happening now? I mean, when it comes to planning expressways, planning public transportation.
No, I went back to the National Physical Plan. Right? This is a document that everybody in government, I was in government, we all have been at various times in government, everybody knows this document. And in that document, there were certain growth areas that were identified. And there were certain areas that were identified as being, central province was going to be losing population. If not constant, it was going to be losing population. But, for politicians, that kind of thing is not palatable. So, they tend to sort of throw words in and say, we'll now change that, and Kandy is going to be some industrial zone or something like that. But it doesn't make any sense, because if you have this National Physical Plan that probably all the departments, ministries have given input, and it has been there for a long time, there's a mechanism for revising it. And you can't suddenly say that now Kandy is going to be a priority area. Now, I can tell you where this problem started, to some extent. When the Colombo metro development, which was a 225 million project, started soon after the war, then, it was going well, because we had plans, we had a lot of things off the shelf. People were complaining about the size of the houses and so on. Those were all things that had been worked up before by the professionals. And what the government did was they just kept on implementing them. Then we came to the other strategic cities project. And now suddenly Kandy is a strategic city. Now that's where the problem started. It should not have been a strategic city in that particular initiative. I think to a certain extent the World Bank was at fault in that as well. Now Hambantota was a complete outlier. It was not in the original plan, and everything that went on in Hambantota was kind of ad hoc. Right? But by that time, if you had made the investment, I would say that there is a requirement that you then modify the plan, because you can't say, well, our plan didn't include Hambantota, therefore we are going to walk away from Hambantota and all the investments that were made. You can't do that.
Now that the investment has been made,
you've got to go to do something about it. But Kandy, we had not made such investments. But suddenly, just because the cast of characters changed, the first minister in charge of urban development was from Kandy. Some of the officials were from Kandy, and so on and so forth. Now suddenly Kandy is back in the game.
So whether or not your city gets in the game depends on whether or not your representative becomes
the minister. But then you understand
what
happens. What happens is that 5 years later, when somebody else comes, now suddenly Kandy might get de-emphasized. No, what is the point of having a national physical plan? So that is the inconsistency. What is the point of having long-term electricity generation plans? If some politician just comes and says, oh, no, we have decided no coal, we are going to do something else. Now they don't factor in how long it takes to do the planning, to scope out the projects and get LNG in and clean energy and all that stuff. Now suddenly the whole thing is out the window. Now everybody is running around trying to come up with another plan. But what is the point?
On the subject of LNG, Mr. Chandasiri, I know you're not in power and energy, but as a former government official, I want to ask you this question. There are some serious questions that are being asked now about the Kerawala-Pittiya, the proposed 300 megawatt LNG power plant, specifically about the tender process for that plant and about disqualified bidders, about their bids being considered. There is a National Procurement Commission that was established under the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It's supposed to be an independent commission that overlooks and sets guidelines for and determines national procurement policy. You retired from the RDA 1.5 months ago. During your time at the RDA as Acting Director General and even before that, was there at any point in any of the projects that you all undertook, was there any input that came from the National Procurement Commission?
Not from National Procurement Commission, but then say around up to about 2005, 2006, there was a procurement committee or procurement board. So then in finance ministry, and we had a lot of interaction with them whenever we had a problem, and they came up with the first sort of guideline book, procurement guidelines, national procurement guidelines. I think it was in 1996 or 19.
The blue book.
Blue book. Right? But then before that, it was in the financial regulations. There was a chapter in financial regulations about procurement. And
is that blue book being followed?
Financial regulations?
No, the procurement guidelines?
It was followed up to maybe 2007 or 2008, where that procurement committee was dissolved.
It was dissolved?
It was dissolved to form a new one, but the new one was not formed to a certain extent, and then so it got it died a natural death sort of thing.
Dr. Gunaran, I want to ask you, the National Procurement Commission, we haven't heard much about them since it was established.
Me too.
I was doing some research earlier today and I found out that one of the commissioners actually had resigned.
And I also don't know much about it, and what has happened to it and where is it, we don't know.
So is it a failure? Given what you're seeing that's happening with the allegations that
it looks like, because if the unsolicited proposals are still continuing, if unsolicited business is going on, what's the purpose of having procurement commission? If the procurement commission is there, you should lay down the guidelines and say, look, you need to, either there should be a way of benchmarking, there should be some way of sensible benchmarking, that you should not spend unnecessarily money on projects where it is people's money which is being wasted. Look at a system of a private man or private company. If it is private company's money, if it is a private individual's money, would he or that company spend unnecessarily for something? Won't, because it is his money and he wants to have the justice done for his money. Now here the problem is, it is public's money, but the decision makers are not the public. Decision makers are the public's representatives in the government elected for 5 years. Now that's the whole crux of the matter here. Now there should be a system, therefore, to ensure that the public interest is taken care of when you spend public money. For that only the procurement commission, I presume, is at least if it is established, I don't know where it is now, but if the same procurement unsolicited business is going on 2, 3, 4, 10 times the expenditure, now for 64 million Sri Lankan rupee average expenditure for railway station signalling, you spend 2,200 million. Now what's the purpose of having a National Procurement Commission?
That is being run on public funds as well.
Now I wrote, when the 19th Amendment was being considered, I said this is unnecessary, that it was too complicated a structure to have an independent commission that would basically be looking over everybody's shoulders. I personally find...
But what's the alternative then?
The model that he talked about, because I've been on rather complicated procurement committees myself. And what we really need is, we need guidance from people who's we are not people who do procurement 24 hours of the day, 7 days a week, right? We do other things. But we are then put on technical evaluation committees or tender boards or cabinet appointed committees and so on, right? So what we need is, we need to refer to somebody and get help. Look at precedent. How has it been done in a similar case? So that cell that they had,
yes,
I found it quite useful when it existed. Now even this entity, I can remember, I didn't do the phone calls myself, but there was a committee that I was on where the secretary would continually, we would say, okay, how about 14 days for somebody's response to be given, and then he would come back and says, no, the commission says it should be 14 working days, not 14 days, and so on. So you needed that kind of sounding board. And that I found quite useful. But I didn't find the particular structure in the 19th Amendment very helpful, personally. And my opinions are on record. I published it, I objected to it at that time.
When you look at the tender processes that we have now, we're seeing, it was reported in the Sunday Times, I believe, yesterday, that the recommendation of the TEC, the Technical Evaluation Committee, with regard to this Kerawalapitiya project had essentially been disregarded. And the Cabinet Committee on Economic Management had basically redirected the SCAPC, the Cabinet Appointed Procurement Committee, to consider these disqualified bidders.
Well, you know, I mean, my experience about competitive procurement is that, in fact, you know, it's not a mathematical issue right at the end. It's about who gets included, who gets disqualified, the marking schemes. These are the critical areas. And I've had experience, so I've seen technical evaluation committees that get into financial assessment, when in fact they should be doing technical evaluation, right? And leave the financial issue, which is the second envelope, to the next stage. So there's role confusion. I would say these are not perfect bodies, but I don't agree with the idea that, you know, somebody can just zoom in, non-technical people from a sort of a body made up by politicians should be involved in these things. I disagree with that completely. But I think you usually have a technical evaluation committee and a negotiating committee or a tender board. So that's supposed to be the way it works. That second body is supposed to make some of these more qualitative judgments. Am I right? Is that?
Yeah,
no?
yeah. But I think his question is different. What he's saying is that technical evaluation committee has sort of rejected, and the negotiating committee or the cabinet appointed
and just brought them in.
They are accepted. They are something like that.
Mr. Gunaran, what do you think the Auditor General will have to say about all these departures from procedure? In terms of the Central Expressway, we have an absolutely fascinating case because in round one, the initial stage, we had a marine construction company, a bridge building company, and another company. Can I say the name? Okay. Taisei Corporation. Two of them don't bid because they clearly don't have the experience to build the Central Expressway. And then Taisei is probably so confident they didn't bring their bid bond. And so when they announced that this is annulled, they didn't call for another tender. They mysteriously reopened that round and then imported another company, Fujita Corporation, and at the CNC and the project committee stage, they are rejected because they don't have necessary expertise, their financial records are not in order, and so on. Then they decide to have yet another bid or another cabinet paper in which they have whilst the competitive bidding process is on, they decide to cancel that competitive bidding process and bring in yet another bid from Fujita. And then the CNC and the project committee say, no, we can't have them because they are failed. And, you know, then they say that the government of Japan wants this failed and disqualified company, when it turns out that it's an advisor to the Japanese company who's making this kind of request for consideration. But we have a letter from the Japanese ambassador that says that the government of Japan is in no position to raise objections to the results of a lawful tender procedure, right? And then this thing goes on. Finally, they decide that we'll give it to Taisei, whom they were trying to bring in all along anyway, and then they say, and here's the wonderful bit. They say, well, you form a consortium with the failed bidder, Fujita, because the government of Japan wants it. Well, what do you think the Auditor General is going to say about all this?
Faraz, now both are failed companies, right? Both are failed companies.
Both are failed companies for different reasons, but they've both failed. One, they've tried to bring in the beginning, then the guy forgets his bid bond, this big company, Taisei, yeah, with its history of litigation and investigated by the Japanese Fair Trade Commission and so on. And then you have Fujita, who's got its own set of disqualifications. And then you have the minister having a meeting with these people. There's no ministry secretary. He's forgotten all about the cabinet-appointed negotiating committee, and he's having a little meeting, all ultra vires, right? And he's asking them to form a consortium. And the failed bidder says he's confused. It's his letter I'm quoting from. He says, I'm confused why I'm here.
What's your question?
My question is what the Auditor General is going to have to say about this complete fix.
Well, I think about the details that you gave, I am not aware of.
No, but the process, it's a question of process.
Yeah,
that's what
Chansari might be able to answer in detail. But regarding Auditor General, I think you raised an important question. To my knowledge, Auditor General comes up only after the process is over. Because Auditor General's role comes up at the end of a particular year, you get the processes audited. He does not come in before the things are implemented. That's where the planning process has to be. That's where the procurement commissions or whatever should come in.
Procurement commission under the 19th amendment could have intervened.
Should have intervened.
Could intervene.
Could intervene. It's there.
But if it is there,
it's there. It's I mean, you can.
Professor,
the website is
Professor,
operational.
thank you
Procom.gov.
reminding us about this National Procurement Commission, because several months ago we were treated to the fact that several files from the FCID in terms of national procurement were being sent to the National Procurement Commission, and from there we've never heard one word from there, apart from what Nadeem says that one of these gentlemen have resigned before they apparently started work. So what you're saying, Mr. Gunran, is that the people will have to wait until they're robbed before the Auditor General can come and make his pronouncement.
Well, unfortunately, Auditor General's role does not appear only after. Only after the action is done, Auditor General gets the documents also. Because the auditing procedure in Sri Lanka is post-auditing, not pre-auditing.
This is
this is my understanding. I may be wrong there.
But that's why you have the independent commission.
That's why you have the
independent
planning.
commissions are there to prevent this kind of thing from happening.
No, I mean, first of all, my point is, if all what you said is correct, if all what you said described, it looks like a peculiar kind of Yahapalane.
It's not
peculiar. It can't be Yahapalane in its good sense,
It isn't peculiar in the least. We had the Prime Minister 9 days after our organization carried a report on the bond scam. 9 days after that, he makes a statement in Parliament and defends his decision to change the way bonds are issued, only for the Auditor General, like you correctly say later on, to say that this is not the least cost method, right? And then we say something about the Central Expressway. About 4 days later, he comes and makes a statement in Parliament telling us that he's saved 25 billion, and that's why we've got upset. We are not upset in the least about that. What we are upset about is that this process has been completely abused by him and his ministers.
Mr. Chandrasekhar, a quick question for you before you go. Faraz was mentioning, Faraz mentioned several companies, the Taisei Corporation specifically. I was reading a fairly recent report in the New York Times, which said that 99 Japanese companies, Taisei being one of them, had been ordered to pay a fine or had to pay some sort of compensation to the US government for this practice of bid rigging. They call it dango, where corporations collude among themselves to decide who gets which bid. It's sort of we'll decide on a win-win situation for both of us. It's oligopoly, corporate collusion. Judging by the series of events that Faraz just narrated, it's beginning to look like there might have been some kind of bid rigging happening here. During your time as Acting Director General of the RDA, did you encounter such incidents?
Not while I was acting as Director General, but before that. I think that the similar sort of thing happened in 2000. I it was 2010, I think, 2010 or 2010, I think, where Taisei was involved in Outer Circular Highway Package 2 contract. There again, there were three companies who sort of bought the tender documents, but only Taisei submitted the bid. Something like that I can recall. Then it was cancelled, and the RDA tried to, and the ministry, we tried to go for sort of to advertise the project in Tokyo itself through a fair, and but that was thwarted.
Dr. Samarjeeva, you mentioned you served on TECs before as well. Did you encounter this sort of bid rigging when it came to public procurement?
No, I mean, in my case, we are not talking on this scale. These are massive construction projects. I have dealt with construction projects, mostly consultancy kinds of things. Complicated, but the scale is different, and I haven't seen that. I mean,
and Dr. Gunaran, you were formerly Secretary, Ministry of Transport. Lots of construction work happening in the Ministry of Transport, Sri Lanka Railways, SLTB, public transportation in general. Have you encountered bid rigging? Is it a commonplace practice in within our tender procedure in Sri Lanka?
If you implement the tender procedure properly, it's difficult for anyone to rig. You laid down your specifications, and you very clearly lay down your requirements, and then you set up an independent, unbiased technical evaluation committee, and according to the guidelines you have your procurement board. It's very difficult for anyone to go and rig that one. But there may be certain collusions going on among bidders, and then there may be certain things which are beyond our control, which of course will have to be brought in by way of things.
But when because I was reading up on this today as well, when you have pre-selected 3 companies that are going to bid,
that's in this government to government.
That's where the problem is. That's where the problem
three.
is. Now, on what basis you pre-selected is the question.
And only one of them has experience in building roads.
The pre-selection procedure, that is where the problem comes in. Because if you have a kind, of course there is a necessity to pre-select in certain cases, because you don't want to see unqualified, unexperienced and not skillful companies, just bogus ones with board lally coming up and bidding, which of course the necessity is there, for which there are ways of specifying your things and going and screening your criteria and coming up and doing the pre-selection. Then you open the whole thing for bidding. Now there is a procedure called expression of interest calling, and there you have these kind of things laid down. I'm not saying that everything will be 100% clean and every time, but the majority of the problems can be set aside if you adopt the procedure properly. And my only disagreement with Professor Samarjeeva is not what he said, but these things normally don't take more time than what we go and spend in most of the cases for hair splitting unsolicited proposal screening. It also takes sometimes even more time than going up and doing these unsolicited proposals. That's all. We can very clearly adapt our normal procurement guidelines and procedures and go and do it. It is our government, it's for us. And if you want to change the procedures, we change it. And even if you can bid without having money, it's up to us to change that procedure and get the bids done.
Right, thank you very much. With that, we're going for our final break on the show. You're watching Face the Nation. We'll be right back with the final round. Welcome back. You're with Face the Nation. Dr. Lalitha Gunaruwan, this is your final question. You have 3 minutes to answer. Of all government activities, public procurement is most vulnerable to corruption. It has a major impact on how taxpayer money is spent. In your opinion, how is public procurement to then evolve to cope with the growing need for integrity as we see in present-day Sri Lanka?
Well, very philosophical question, but let me try to give an answer briefly. First of all, we need to identify the need. As Professor Samarjeeva pointed out, when money is spent, we have to know the priorities. Now that has to be decided by the policymakers and the bureaucrats and the planners together. For example, I saw in the capital expenditure in 2016, 11% of the total government's capital expenditure was on highways. 145 billion Sri Lankan rupees out of 1,336 is on highways. Railways gets only 15 billion. Now, what does this mean? Whether we have identified our priorities right, whether we have prioritized the highways over railways. Now, in that kind of a situation, is our public transport master plan and the policy philosophy that has been laid down since long time, since John Deanda's time, has that been forgotten? Now, these kind of questions have to be first answered. The prioritization of capital expenditure, where the money should go in. Second step is, when you decide the sectors to be spent, then you identify the projects and you need to plan the projects properly, and those projects will have to be implemented with the most efficient capital efficient manner. That means you should get the benefits derived with the least possible capital expenditure. What matters is not how much you spend in terms of rupees and cents. What matters is what you created as an asset. If a given quality of a railway line or a highway or a power plant or a water project, if the given quality of capital project is implemented with the least possible money, then only you should be happy. What happens in this country is the people also tend to get happy when you see in the news screen in the TV that this project, the government has borrowed so much of heavy loans from this country and we have spent so much of money. Utter stupidity. It's not the scale of the money which matters, but the true physical product that you get on the ground. A kilometer of railway line, a bridge, a kilometer of a two-lane highway, a power plant of this capacity. There, it is up to the planning people, the professionals, to decide the best way of procurement, best way of project implementation, best way of developing that capital item. And if we short circuit there, for one reason or the other, our country's future is doomed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lalitha Siri Gunaruwan. My next question is to Mr. Nimal Chandrasiri, former Additional Director General of the Road Development Authority, also an engineer by nature. In this conversation, we also mentioned that there is a great deal of importance that needs to be attached to multi-sectoral consultation, multi-stakeholder discussion. How much further on do we have to go to reach this?
I think there has to be a sort of apex body where these stakeholders could be sort of gathered around and discussed. Formally, it was the National Planning Department, where all the proposals from different ministries were evaluated and then prioritized according to the country's planning policy. Whether it's happening in that manner is questionable at the moment. So that's why former Transport Secretary's grouse is that the railway is not getting money, highways is getting money, is given money. So all these things should have been evaluated and come up with the sort of national policy. If the policy is for transportation, whether it's highways or rail, doesn't really matter. What is required is an efficient transportation from A to B. So whether you are going to use a car or whether you are going to have a electric train, I mean, people will decide. And so that is lacking, looks like it is lacking. I am not sure whether that's functioning now in the Finance Ministry or in the Economic Affairs Ministry. But looks like it's lacking. So that apparently we can see that there is a disparity in selecting different sectors. Right.
There are complaints over irregularities over multi-million-dollar contracts for major road construction projects. The President was heard to say that we need a national policy on highways. Now, going forward, do you think this could be a possible solution, or what are your suggestions in the way forward for Sri Lanka?
Well, we had the National Policy on Highways, a document, and then we had a 5-year master plan from 2010 to 2015, and we are now in the process of preparing the next master plan to be completed very soon, I suppose. So these plans are there, but when it comes to implementation, if the plan is not implemented and you deviate from that particular plan, I mean, then there should be, agreed that there should be revisions, but then that revision also should be in a sort of a formalized way.
So how do we rectify this, Mr. Chandrasiri?
Develop a system where each step has a sort of a milestone. Okay, this should be done within this time, and these are the people who are entrusted, and this is the way it should be done.
Are we that short-sighted that we can't really devise a methodology, a simple methodology?
You can. Methodology is there, but the methodology, to implement the methodology, there are a lot of obstructions. When you try to implement the methodology in a sort of concrete way, of course there should be some flexibility, but then it shouldn't be so flexible that the final original objective is lost on the way.
Are you saying that politicization has a major role to do?
Yeah, politicization, and of course the politicians cannot sort of get these things done in a vacuum. So there is collusion by officials also. So I think there has to be a culture. This culture has to be developed to a better level, I suppose.
Thank you very much. My final question is to Professor Rohan Samarajiva. I think we had a rather lengthy discussion on several aspects that govern the general public. Dr. Samarajiva, we have on the one hand a lot of Sri Lankans living in abject poverty. And on the other, we have short-sighted development projects with no planning, no proper vision, manufactured urgency, serious allegations of corruption, malpractice, fraud. We have bid rigging, inactive independent commissions, and politicization. So my question to you is, how do we address all these issues and move forward?
I think my short answer, I mean, I agree with the President, but I think he's got only part of the solution. He says we need a policy. Everybody going around, we need a policy. But there are policies, but there's no implementation, execution capability. That's, I think, what is really lacking. So just to say that we have to have policies isn't enough. We need to have the capacity. So that's why I go back to the decimation of the technical capabilities within government. We had something called the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment, which was capable of bringing, of dealing with, assembling foreign or local private investment and mobilizing it. Because I don't think we can do this. I mean, the reality is, while we may think that we can manage with our resources, the reality is we can't. The reality is we have to either go for this ad hoc government-to-government relationships, which I'm not a fan of, or we have to go for public-private partnerships. With public-private partnerships, you can actually put together structured proposals, and you can have competitive bidding, you can have points, you can have marking schemes, you can have all these things for that. But you need the capacity. And unfortunately, what we've done in the last 10-15 years is whatever capacity we built up has been decimated. We don't have that capacity inside government. So I think unless we start looking at the capacity within government, at the level of ministries, at the level of the planning apparatus, and let's take a simple thing. Before a cabinet paper goes in, there should be a checklist. Have the appropriate concurrences been obtained? Have certain things been done? This is done all over the world. But I think we've got cabinet papers being smuggled through without people even reading them. Not everybody reading them. So I think we've got a serious problem of a structural kind. And then unfortunately, when you come to all those corruption statements that you made, I think what you have is a structural problem where people are not getting what they want. The people are stuck in traffic on the Kandy Road, and they are saying, okay, do something, right? And then the politicians will say, okay, we'll come up with a solution. Now there's opportunity for corruption. It's the same story that we had with electricity. Once you have got blackouts, people are ready for anything. You can come up with any high-priced emergency power sources, right? So we have to get the system right. I think there's no alternative to that, and we have to strengthen our government system. We have 101.6 million government officials in this country, but we can't do what needs to be done inside government. I'm sorry. It's not that they're not being allowed to, but there's a problem of capacity in government as well.
All right, thank you very much. With that, we draw to a close this panel discussion on public investment in infrastructure and, of course, highways. I'd like to thank our guests for being on the show with us tonight. Dr. Lalitha Siri Gunaruwan, Senior Lecturer at the Columbia University and former Secretary, Ministry of Transport. Ms. Limal Chandrasiri, former Additional Director General of the Road Development Authority, also an engineer by profession. And finally, Professor Rohan Samarjiva, Founding Chair of Learn Asia. Thank you for being on the show with us tonight. A thank you also goes out to Nadim Majid, Chaturang Hapwarachi and Faraj Shaukat Ali for always being with us here at News First. Now, tonight we focus our attention on a slightly technical issue, but nevertheless an issue that impacts your life: infrastructure development, procurement processes and corruption. Remember that sovereignty vests in you, the citizens of Sri Lanka. So the next time you're sitting in a cafe, sipping on a cafe latte and thinking, what am I going to do in Sri Lanka, or what am I going to do with all this corruption taking place, remember that it is incumbent upon you as a citizen, as a voter, to hold to account those elected officials. Remember, they are your public servants as they are mine. Good night.